Welcome to the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. I'm your host, Donald Grothoff, along with my wife, Gina. Our goal is to give voice to the hidden mind of obsessive compulsive disorder, better known as OCD. In this podcast, we are interviewing yet another person dealing with OCD either professionally or personally. So stay with us for this impactful conversation. We would love to have your comments or to have you as a guest, or if you wish to tell your OCD or anxiety story, please visit us at invisiblewheelchair.com. So let's find out more about who we're interviewing today. Well, it is a real pleasure to bring back Jason Adams. If you hadn't heard it, on our Stories from the OCD side, we had Jason Adams a couple weeks ago tell his story about how he got his OCD and being a dad with OCD. And today he's back because we're going to discuss and delve more into what it's like to be a dad with OCD, and then also talk about his book that he written, OCDad. Jason Adams, of course, is a dad of twins, a teacher, a writer, a musician, and of course a guy with OCD. Most of his days are spent on a combination of chasing the tornadoes around the house, squeezing a few more words onto the page, cleaning the kitchen, and trying not to fall too far out of shape. Some days, though, he gets to have a conversation like this about OCD, mental health, or just life in general, and he finds that a really great thing too. So join us now as he and I delve more into what it's like to be a dad with OCD and his book. Now, before we get to that interview, let's hear a word about our sponsor.
Today I'm here to talk about Q Science's sleep spray. Q Sciences has a number of different sprays. There's a melatonin sleep spray that contains melatonin, 5-HTP, and L-theanine. And we've used other melatonin products to help our children with falling asleep. Melatonin is something that occurs naturally in our body that helps us quiet and calm down for sleep. And yet I really feel like I've seen a difference in the spray versus other products. Our youngest is here to talk about it. What things did you like better about the spray versus the other things?
I don't like the chew tablets because they leave like a weird taste, and they're mainly like they also have like you get bits in your teeth.
Okay, so Q Science's spray.
It's a lot better, I'd say. The taste is pretty decent and it works well.
Okay. I'm happy with the quality of these products and how they're helping our whole family. If you'd like to learn more,
simply go to qsciences.focusedhealthyfamily.com. That's the letter Q, sciences.focusedhealthyfamily.com, or visit invisiblewheelchair.com and find out more information there.
There are a lot of supplement products out there, yet you want one that's of good quality. Check out Q Sciences for your family.
And now, let's get to that interview. Well, Jason, it's wonderful to have you back again. You were on here for the stories on the OCD side, and now we want to talk a little bit more about your book and about being a dad with OCD. You know, I'm a dad who's dealing with OCD, but you were in it in a different side of it, which I want to explore that today. So. What I'd like to do first, for those that maybe didn't hear the stories from the OCD side, I want to just kind of do a brief synopsis of your story about your OCD and how it came about or whatever. And I'll remind the audience they can listen back to the stories from the OCD side where I had Jason up there before, Jason Adams. You can hear his full story there. But let's just do a quick brief kind of your story, and then we'll talk some more.
Sure. Well, it's fantastic to see you again and fantastic to talk again. So basically the story behind this discussion and my OCD really starts back in 2019. So in 2019, I became a dad of twin boys, and received the diagnosis of OCD within the same 3 months. when people hear that, they sometimes ask, were your boys kind of the onset incident for your OCD? And actually, the truth is, no, they weren't. That was very much a situation where having kids really exacerbated symptoms that I already had, but didn't know I have. So as of kind of 3 months into my boys being born, I was struggling, and I was struggling with intrusive thoughts that I didn't like or understand. My wife and I were really starting to notice a downturn in lots of things, in my mood, in my energy, in our relationship, and our patience with everything. So we sat down and basically said something needed to change. I was very fortunate to connect with a very, very helpful therapist. And over the next year and a half, 2 years, we delved very deeply into OCD therapy in the form of cognitive behavioral therapy and ERP, so exposure with response prevention. And with time and practice, things got better. That's the short version of it. And that's ignoring a year and a half, 2 years of work, but things got better. And one thing I started reflecting on about 6 months into the process was there were plenty of resources out there for OCD as a general topic, plenty of resources out there for how to parent your kids, but I couldn't find anything in terms of how do you parent your kids if you're a parent with OCD? How do you tell the difference between healthy parental instincts and intrusive thoughts? To what extent can you measure how your intrusive thoughts are interfering with your parenting? All these questions that I had, my therapist and I were really trying to fill in some of those blanks. And over time, I thought to myself, well, there's no way I'm the only one in this situation. I can't be the only parent with OCD out there. And by extension, I can't be the only parent who wishes there were more resources available for this. So I decided to sit down and write that book myself. And what came out of it is OCDad, Learn to be a Parent with a Mental Health Disorder. It's printed and published and available now. I'll mention my website, www.theocdad.ca. There's links to all kinds of retailers on there for buying it. But essentially, it is part memoir of my struggles getting through OCD as a new parent. It's part kind of instructional. Again, I'm not a therapist and I'm not pretending to be a therapist, but I've recorded the CBT and ERP exercises that worked really well for me and laid them out in a section in the book. And then it's also part sort of forward-looking, contemplating what OCD will mean to me in the future things that I might run into with taking care of my boys. And it's something now that I'm just happy to share with anyone and everyone who wants to listen and read. So in a nutshell, that's where I've come from, and here we are now.
Okay. Well, I'm a dad that doesn't have OCD, but has kids that are dealing with it. And so, I know the feelings of a dad. We have doubts, we have worries, all of that. Can you delve into a little bit about what you went through, what the feelings and the thoughts and all that you went through, being that you actually have the OCD?
Absolutely. So my journey to a diagnosis, as I call it, it was, I think, a strange one in some ways. It was very gradual and very abrupt at the same time. When my boys were first born, I had what I felt were a lot of the same concerns that a lot of parents would have. I felt very, very protective. Obviously, newborns are very delicate. So I, for a little while, saw every little movement as a life or death situation. Kind of are their heads supported? Does that cough mean something? Are they the right temperature? Are they the right color? All these kinds of things. And over time, what I noticed was, family, friends were all starting to talk about, of course, everyone feels those things, but, time and experience, and you settle down and you start to realize what you should react to and what you shouldn't. But in my case, those cycles never relaxed and they never subsided, even in the face of clear evidence that there wasn't a threat of some kind. And when I really started to notice there was a problem, I was battling intrusive thoughts of far off disaster scenarios that had no relevance to the moment we were in. our boys were 1 month old. It's not as if we were going to take them to a public swimming pool, but I was getting intrusive thoughts of them drowning
Wow.
all the time. Not even if we were in the bathtub with 2 inches of water in it, it didn't matter. I was getting intrusive thoughts of them getting hit by a car or falling off balconies. And again, they're 1 month old. We didn't have them anywhere near any of those hazards, but day in and day out, daytime, nighttime, those thoughts were there all the time. And I was just resorting to mental compulsions most of the time to try and settle them down. And as anyone with OCD knows, the cycle of obsessions and compulsions is very repetitive and very draining. And as a parent, the extra element that came in was there's shame and guilt and anger and frustration, because you're not the calm, relaxed, stoic father you pictured yourself being. You're suffering from something that you can't define. You can see it affecting your parenting, and you feel like you're not being a good enough parent for your boys, but you don't know why, and you can't solve it. So shame, anger, guilt, all those things, you're suffering at a time when you're supposed to be a provider and a protector, when you're supposed to be rock solid and there for everybody. And that was really complex to manage. And that was a big part of why I started getting impatient and frustrated with everything. But I didn't know what any of that was. I didn't think I had OCD. It never crossed my mind. I only knew as much about OCD as any person off the street would know about OCD, just the stereotypical symptoms. And, I knew a little more I knew to dig deeper from my work as a teacher, and understanding that in every mental health disorder, there is stigma and stereotypes. And then you have to dig deeper to really get to the core of how everything looks in real life. But I didn't apply that same standard to myself at the time. And that was the gradual part, because that went on for months and I couldn't figure it out. It just gradually got worse and worse. The abrupt part was when I sat down with my therapist for the first 2 sessions and just poured my heart out about all this. He just looked at me, kind of nodded, and then he took out a Post-it and he wrote down a book title, and he said, "All right, go home and read this. And in a week, I want you to come back and we're going to start our work." And the title of the book was Overcoming OCD by Dr. Jonathan Abramowitz, which I would highly recommend.
Yeah.
And I kind of looked at him and went, "OCD?" And he kind of just quietly nodded.
Yeah.
And then over the next few months, there was just this massive catharsis of just, oh my gosh, this is what's going on. Every checklist in this book, I would write "me," yes, in big letters in the margins going. So, that was the process for me, both as an individual and as a parent, of coming to it. So again, like it just months and months and months of symptoms getting worse, not knowing what was happening. And then in one fell swoop, my therapist pinpoints what's going on, and then the work started.
Well, and it sounds what I'm hearing is, because those you mentioned the worries of the fears of drowning them, and I remember back, especially the first child, like you say, I've seen those commercials where the first one, they drop a pacifier and you're sterilizing it and all this. By the third one, you're wiping it on your pants and putting it in,
Yeah.
But what I'm hearing you say is that, for you had some of the fears that, like I had fears of, I can remember a dream I had where my child was on top of a sand dune and there was a bulldozer coming at it and I couldn't get up the sand to save his life, and it scared the hell out of But for you, it sounds like what happened was those just kept coming. Like they got, they just wouldn't leave you alone. Whereas, I woke up in that dream and it didn't come, I didn't have to deal with it after that. That sounds pretty much like what kind of happened.
Yeah, absolutely. That's really one of the ways that I've come to define the difference between healthy parental instincts and OCD symptoms as they relate to parenting is, and it's interesting. There's a lot of neuroscience that backs this up. It's, here's an example that I always use that I think people can relate to. Say you're cooking chicken and you take raw chicken out of the container, you put it on your counter, cut it up, put it into a pan. There's a bit of chicken juice left on the counter. Part of your brain goes, there's bacteria in that juice. That could be a threat. You need to clean that up. The emotional part of your brain feels a little bit of fear, a little bit of motivation. The action part of your brain makes you go get the cleaner, spray it, wipe it, clean it up. Once all that is done, it's done. right? Those sections of your brain shut back down, the threat is gone. And with parenting, can be a lot of the same thing, where again, like you wake up in a panic because you're worried that one of your boys is on a sin, but then all of a sudden you wake up and you say, oh, I'm in my house. This isn't a real threat. There's no need to react to this any further. In an OCD brain, especially with parenting, that initial cycle of threat never stops. It just, it's like, it's like when someone's car alarm goes off and they're not there to turn it off. It just keeps going. And that really manifested in day-to-day life as well, because, for example, falling from heights was one of my big intrusive thoughts for my boys, them falling from any heights. So once they got a little older and started playing on climbers, for example, I was always on the edge of, I'm fighting off intrusive thoughts of them falling, and then they might wobble on a climber. So you can imagine that all of a sudden in my brain, I have this proof that this disaster scenario is about to come true. So I react with like fight or flight intensity. It's like, no, come down. And my wife is going like, he's 2 feet off the ground and you're right there. Like, it's okay. But you're going through that cycle constantly. And after a while, it becomes unmanageable because it's exhausting. We can't live in fight or flight. Yeah. There's a reason it only comes up in certain situations. But that difference and that persistent sense of threat is absolutely a major component of it.
Well, and were you home with the kids? Maybe go through a day, when you were in the midst of it. What was a day like for you?
Sure. So I'm a teacher, and I have summers off. I work in the public system in Canada. So we were very fortunate in that our boys were born in July. So I was able to be home for the first couple of months and help take care of them, which with newborn twins, to any twin parents who are listening, and don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to just single out twin parents. I think being home with any newborn is exhausting, but I can't deny that twins is very exhausting. So I was home during those first 2 months, and a typical day. So, in terms of the day's events and how OCD would factor into those, once our boys' sleep schedules started coming around a little bit, we'd go in, we'd get them in the morning, we do diaper changes. Well, diaper changes were a massive onset incident for me, a massive trigger for contamination obsessions. Newborns are messy with their diapers. As any parent of newborn knows, every now and then they fling their hands or they kick their legs and stuff gets where it's not supposed to be. Again, a very typical. Or
the fountain happened.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Or I won't get too graphic, but people listening won't be able to tell, but we're kind of giving each other the nod here. Yeah. We understand. It's, but again, typical parenting thing. Kid gets poop on his hand, you wipe it off, you make sure the child is nice and clean, none under the fingernails, no cause for concern. For me, hepatitis A, did that get in his eye? Did he touch his mouth? Do I need to clean this? Do I need to clean that? Is his hand clean enough? And sometimes that would take a full day where I would need to see them wake up the next morning and have proof that they're not sick before I'd really calm down about that. So then we would keep our routine. So our boys were nursing for the first year. Once they started on solids, for example, we'd have their meal times 3-4 times a day. Feeding would be something where choking obsessions would pop in a lot, put me on hyper alert for that. During rest times, I noticed that I always had a compulsion around rest time where I had to check their onesies 3 times. I had to check their sleep sacks 3 times, and then I had to check their breathing 3 times in 3 different ways. If I didn't do that, I'd be worried that I'd come in and find them suffocated and it would be my fault. And again, a lot of parents worry about newborn babies suffocating in their sleep when they're really young. But there comes a point where you say, okay, they know how to sleep. They're becoming more independent. They can roll over safely if they need to. But for me, even in those stages, I could picture it right up to the police tape around the house and the flash of the ambulance signs because a child had died. And that was persistent until they were about a year old. So those are kind of the day-to-day things, right? And then, of course, if we get into play, it would be something like if we were playing at heights, we'd have those obsessions that I mentioned before. If I was taking them to a park where there were acorns on the ground, choking obsessions would flash up, all those types of things. I mean, so you can imagine that the typical exhaustion of kind of wrangling newborns plus fighting down all those obsessions and compulsions, plus that shame and guilt and anger
Wow.
and frustration that I was mentioning before, that's where the exhaustion comes in. And that's why I think it's so important for people to get help. And that's why I'm so fortunate that I did get help.
So, well, one thing I did want to ask, how did your wife deal? Was she nervous about ever having you alone with the kids during that time?
So that's a really good question. And I think that's an important topic for parents to talk about. No, not in my case. I've been very fortunate in some ways in that any obsessions and compulsions I've had around kids and parenting have never been sort of they're called fear of harm or fear of causing harm obsessions.
Yeah.
I've never been worried that I would hurt my kids, or I was more worried that there'd be something that I would miss that would cause them to get hurt, or that some kind of external factor would hurt them. So if anything, I was overprotective as opposed to worried that I would do something. So, the other thing is that with twins in the early going, that discussion wasn't really an option. We needed both of us to really help and keep them going during those first 2 months. But in general, no, that wasn't a concern. And a big reason why it wasn't was that I was able to articulate my obsessions after a couple sessions with my therapist and explain what was going on. And remember that I had never really identified any of these situations before. I had a lot of coping mechanisms to deal with them before. And I've generally been, a successful, competent person. I mean, you can take superficial indicators. I have a master's degree. We have a steady income, stable house, healthy marriage, all those kinds of things. I managed my mental health in the past by exercising, playing music, sleeping for a whole weekend sometimes if I had to, but obviously with kids, you can't do those things anymore.
Yeah, really.
I don't abuse substances, any of those things that would make you question whether the child should be left alone. I didn't exhibit a lot of those things. Things really peaked once the boys were born. So once she saw that I was getting help, and once I articulated what was going on, that wasn't a concern. It is important for people to know, though, I think, for awareness, that there are parents who struggle with, for example, they'll be cooking in the kitchen and chopping vegetables, and the second they pick up a knife, they get an intrusive thought about hurting their kids with the knife. Yeah. There are parents who have obsessions about their kids falling down the stairs and them not feeling bad, or them really yelling at their parents or yelling at their kids a lot and not feeling bad. Those ones are out there. It's really important that those things get brought up and talked about in safe settings, because living with that and having it unaddressed is stressful and it's unsustainable. So again, I was very fortunate not to have to manage any of that. It was more about coming down to kind of rational standards of protection and risk management, threat management, and fear and anxiety. But there are absolutely situations out there where more intensive and specific discussions like that need to be had. So yeah.
True. So let's, I guess, talk about your book, because you talked about at the beginning, you brought it out because you didn't find the resources for a dad who has it, or a parent, really, for that matter, not just dads, but a parent that has. And you said you talked about it being in 3 parts, and
Yes.
Of course, the first part we kind of talked about because that's your backstory. But you talked about strategies and exercises. So let's talk about those other 2 parts, because one part was about, you put in there about some strategies that worked for you that now can help other dads out there. And then you talked about how about looking ahead, and so I think that would be important to talk about, because we as parents, we think we're screwing our kids up anyway, and OCD can only exacerbate that. So let's talk about the strategies, I guess, first, and what you have in there, and what it'll do to help other dads.
Absolutely. So you're right. The first section is a combination of backstory, kind of up to and including my OCD diagnosis, my version of the facts about OCD and what I came to learn about it in as straight talk as possible. And then, the strategy section in the second part of the book. So what I did was, again, obsessions and compulsions are categorized in different workbooks. But what I tried to do was categorize based on the ones that affect parenting the most. So the first couple chapters in the second part talk, first of all, about some really helpful general strategies. So I am a huge, I can't stress this enough, huge proponent of writing out thoughts, of journaling. And I'm not talking about sort of the usual, dear diary, I went to work today and it was stressful. I'm talking about just a very candid account of what's going on in your mind. And for several reasons. One is that it helps you articulate what's going on in your mind, but it also gives you some distance from it and lets you evaluate it as both a thinker of the thoughts and a reader of the thoughts. So I give some strategies for how you might do that. I address some reasons why I didn't want to get started and why some other people don't want to get started, and suggest some frameworks for kind of working through those hesitancies. And then I get into strategies for exaggerated threat obsessions and compulsions, exaggerated responsibility obsessions and compulsions. So, I didn't walk out the door the right way and my thoughts aren't right today, so that means one of my kids is going to get hurt. One of the ones that I managed, I outlined some strategies for that. One of them being the just not right feeling. I'm worried my kids are going to get hurt. Why? I just have this feeling. There was something about the way they looked at me as I walked out the door. And then the last one is thought action fusion. One of the ones that I tackle in there is rigid black and white thinking of, I have these thoughts, therefore I am a bad parent, or I have a thought about something bad happening to my child, so something bad is going to happen. So thought action fusion, both in terms of kind of omens predicting the future, but also becoming associated with, I am my thoughts. My thoughts reflect my deepest identity.
By fusion, you're saying that those two are coming together and becoming kind of one, in other words.
Exactly.
Okay.
So and that by thinking something, I'm going to manifest it.
Okay.
Right. So that by thinking that my child is going to drown, or being afraid that my child is going to drown, I'm somehow manifesting that into reality. Okay. Or that by having thoughts that I can't control, that must mean that I'm sick, cursed, insane, any other term you want to associate with it. Right. Yeah. So there are a variety of ERP. So I give an exposure ladder. For example, I explain the subjective units of discomfort scale. And then I outline about 2 to 3 cognitive behavioral therapy exercises that worked for me within each of those categories. So again, I don't want to imply that I'm a therapist, but what I did do was just outline exactly what worked for me so that others might give it a try, or ideally bring it to a therapist and do that with them under guided supervision. That's the intention of those first 2 sections.
Well, yeah, I like the fact you say I'm not a therapist, but going through it, I feel like, because I've been through it now twice, not for me, but with my kids. And my God, we went through so much with it that I feel like I went to school for it. I feel like I've got a master's degree in the because it's just been, we've had to go over and over and do it this and do it. Anyway, so it's interesting you say it that, but we, as being involved in it, I think we have a really good grasp of some things that work for it. So I think it's good.
Well, and in your case, Don, too, I think working so closely with your kids on this, you're as close to going through it personally as anybody could get, because you're doing it with the most important people in your life and the people that you see and are involved with more than anyone in the world, really, right? So I absolutely agree that closeness that you have to it really, it gives you, I think, and it's one of the reasons why I put this in the book, it gives some validity to your perspective on it, for one thing, and it adds some relatability. And one thing that I try and be really clear on in the book as well is I try to have no shame or restriction about the mistakes I made in the process as well. One of the things I mentioned in the first section of the book is I call research like the frenemy of the anxious parent, right? Where you're doing research on, but again, it's that old saying, the worst thing you can do when you're feeling sick is to Google it, right? People talk about that all the time. But one of the things that I talk about is that I spent so long just reading general self-help books. I'm not knocking self-help books. I'm just saying that they're not specifically targeted for OCD. I spent so long doing that. I spent so long just performing my own research and exploring my mind as if it was some kind of fantastical maze. And really all along, I regret not going to a therapist sooner. I regret not working this out before my kids came along. So all those things, I think, again, give some realism and some validity to the content in the book. And that's one of the reasons why I included the exact exercises. But I would say the biggest reason why I put the exact exercises I used in there is to show that the process I used was not something magical or unattainable.
Yeah.
And that was really, really important for me to include in there. And again, I don't want to come across as taking certain things for granted. And I talk about this in the book. I was very lucky. I found a therapist that matched my first language, my budget, my beliefs, my work schedule. I had family support for going in and spending some time on this. Not everybody has those things. But the other thing that and again, I don't want to ever come across as taking that for granted, because I think it's a huge issue. But one big thing I want people to know, and one of the reasons why I put that content in there, is that therapy, in my experience, is not this magical, fantastical process. It's a structured progression of identifying a problem, quantifying and describing a problem, setting a plan to solve it, and taking steps. It's what it is. I don't want it to sound boring, but I do want it to sound practical.
Well, it's almost kind of simplistic in a way, and I don't mean to like degrade it or downgrade it, but the what you do is pretty simple. It's just the fact that the mind is messing it up so much and causing so much resistance to it that it makes it tougher. Because I mean, you're really just, like with us, my child was looking across the way at something she couldn't get near and sitting with it.
Yeah.
Pretty simple to do, but when your mind is tearing you up and and fighting you every inch of the way, that's what makes it difficult. So
absolutely, there's so much that I think that in retrospect, like I didn't know about the mind, but also that for a long time I wouldn't let myself believe about the mind and my thoughts. And I think that speaks to what you were just mentioning there, letting myself accept these things. Yeah. And one thing I will say that's been a major positive change since learning to accept the nature of thoughts and the content of thoughts and separating a sense of self from those thoughts. It's so liberating when you realize that a thought will go away if you let it. It's so liberating to realize that with time and effort, thoughts have less impact on you and less presence in your mind than they did. It's a lot like when people start working out, they say the most addictive part of it is the results. It's the same thing. I don't want to compare it to being, that if you just do this enough, you're going to get better at it. It's important to have guidance. It's important to keep strict track of progress, but absolutely that first barrier of just letting yourself do it and taking the risk of being uncomfortable, you realize that the discomfort doesn't last forever. It seems a lot worse than it actually is. And to relate that back to parenting, to not have intrusive thoughts on a constant basis when I'm with my boys, the amount of presence that I have with them now, the mental presence, the physical presence, the empathy that I have for other parents that are going through something similar is just astounding. It's life-changing. And the other thing that I notice is that now that my intrusive thoughts are not occupying so much of my time and attention and energy, I'm a better parent. And I'm also processing sort of deeper questions about how do I want to approach them moving forward? What do I believe about different things moving forward? And how would I react if I saw this come up with them in the future? And that speaks to the third part of the book that you were asking about there. So the third part is really, first, how would I react as a dad with OCD if I saw OCD coming up in my kids? And you mentioned like we're always nervous about messing up our kids as it is, right? So genetics can play a factor. They may or may not. They may or may not. And that is something where, again, and now I don't want this to sound too simplistic. I have spent many pages of a few different notebooks processing my thoughts about this, but worrying about whether my OCD will manifest in them or whether they're already genetically programmed for it, all the worrying in the world is not going to change that.
No. Well, and the other part of that is having been through it yourself, Now, you will be able to at least have some advantage, I'd say, or because you can at least have the groundwork to know where to begin, instead of the parent who is lost because, oh my gosh, what do I do? You've got, so I'd say even if your kids do show it later on, you'll be a step or two ahead, I think, just for the fact that you've been through it yourself.
I think perspective would be the word that I would use for that. And I talk about that in the book, actually, is having some perspective on what OCD is, what it is not, how much time and money and energy it took, at least for me. And I can't speak to the process for parents who have kids with OCD because I haven't taken one of my own kids through OCD treatment, and I wouldn't want to speculate unfairly about that. But I know my process to come from a place of immense suffering to healing was years and a financial investment, but also that it's worth it. And I see the difference that it makes long-term in my life and for my boys. I know as well, one of the questions about how I will parent my boys is, to what extent should I and will I let my obsessions and compulsions interfere with them and their development? And that's a big question. And again, many pages of multiple notebooks later, the way I feel about it is the way I feel about it is it will be necessary for me to do some journaling and maybe a few exercises in advance of triggers. Heights are a big trigger for me. Them falling is still a big trigger. But if one of them wants to be a rock climber, if one of them wants to learn to be a pilot one day, all these different height associated triggers, I will put in the work. I will do the journaling and the CBT exercises and the time of therapy to ensure that my discomfort doesn't become their discomfort. That is something, though, I would say the biggest step that I know about myself is that is something where I'll have to put in some extra effort on the side, in addition to taking them to those activities and helping them learn. Those are some of the reflections that have come out of looking forward at this. I would say as well that, one of the big questions I ask myself is when and will I tell them about my OCD? One of the reasons that I wrote the book is so that they'll see that I turned a negative into a positive, and I want them to have something concrete. I also use it as a way to both personally and publicly thank my wife, because she was just such a rock solid support for us during those early times, nursing twins, sleeping 2 hours a day, all kinds of different things. And then, of course, dealing with me and my downturn and neither of us understanding why. And I want them to see that, I honor and thank her for that. And I also want them to see that this is what it took for me to process my OCD and turn it into something that is now a positive in my life. And it's something concrete that they'll be able to look at. But to what extent will they ever feel responsible for my OCD? It'll always be my goal that they never have to accommodate my obsessions and compulsions. It'll always be my goal that it's something they know that dad either manages or has managed, but ideally they'll look at it as, this is something that dad has had and has managed, but look how he deals with it. And that's a positive example that I want to set for them. Yeah. So I talk about that and a few other things, but that's really where I've come to so far anyway.
Well, and I think you're very right with that, because I talk to parents all the time. I work with parents, and one of the things I try to tell them is that your mistakes and your issues, that if you've gone through it and you've worked through it and you've come to the other side of it, you've become a great example to them. When they get into a place that they run into that, they'll be able to say, hey, dad made it through it. I know then I can make it through it, so you've been a great example. So, well, I think you and I could probably talk about this for hours, but I think at this point we probably need to wrap it up. And you've given some great information, because I think it's important. I know from the dad side of it, it's tough enough being a dad in it, because I came about it differently than my wife did. And I always talk about, I was kind of military when it first happened with my kids. I got very angry, and I'd come back at them when they're coming at me, and I realized how much that didn't work. and I had to be different. And so you coming out with this and talking about this is another side of it that I think we need to get out there. So I am so appreciative of you being able to share this with people, because the dads out there need to be able to see this and know that they can make it through it, and they can change to be able to make it happen better. So thank you so much for being part of this.
Oh, you're so welcome. No, and I'm so grateful for the opportunity to share the conversation, and I feel gratitude that I'm in a place to be able to share it regardless, because I agree with you. There's always, and once you make progress too, there is this part of you that also looks back at all the things you did that didn't work, right?
Well, yeah.
And honestly, there's part of me, and I hear you saying this a little bit too, and I'll be very candid, like there's part of me that wishes I had done better as a newborn parent. And I don't want to create the wrong impression. Like, I still went to work. I paid all the bills. We did the family photo shoots. We never had moments of unsafe situations or anything like that. Like I kept up the motions, but I was not the person that I wanted to be at that time. I was disappointed in myself, and initially I took the wrong approach. I did not take a structured, proactive, rational approach to symptoms that I didn't understand. I tried to cope for too long. And I look back on that as something that I wish I could change. I'll fully admit it. It's something that I wish I had done differently. And I now look at that as, well, the best that I can do. And so anybody who's interested in the book or conversations, please reach out. If that means the book, great. If that means going to my website and getting in touch with the contact form. I mean, I agree, Don. I think, we should kind of crack a drink and keep the conversation going right now. But I know we have a time limit for now, but I do put it out there that the conversations are out there now, and I hope that this one is super helpful, including the books. So the website is www.theocdad.ca. The book is OCDad, Learning to Be a Parent with a Mental Health Disorder, and I just hope it gets to people who want and need it.
And I'll remind my audience that it will be up on the site, on the invisiblewheelchair.com. So again, Jason, thank you so much for being part of this.
Thank you. Really, really appreciate it.
This concludes this podcast. We hope you will subscribe if you haven't already. Remember, we would love your comments, or if you have a story to tell, we want to put it up on the podcast. Simply go to invisiblewheelchair.com to do that. Don't forget to like us on Facebook at Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. If you or someone you know would like to be a guest, we love guests. So simply go to invisiblewheelchair.com and contact us from there. Gina and I are here to help you or your family get to a better place naturally. Simply visit focusedhealthyfamily.com for more information. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Keep tapping and focusing forward for a better way.